In September of 2008, the Gulf Coast braced itself for one of the most violent storms to approach in nearly a decade. The forecasts had been grim, the swirling mass of Hurricane Maria growing stronger as it moved across the warm waters, feeding on the heat and moisture. Warnings blared across radios and televisions, urging residents to evacuate. Thousands packed highways in long lines of taillights, carrying what they could and fleeing inland to safety. But in every storm, there are those who choose to stay. Some out of necessity, some out of stubbornness, and some out of the belief that they've ridden out storms before, and this one will be no different. Among them was the Duvall family. The Duvalls lived in a modest two-story home just a few blocks from the shoreline. David, the father, worked as a mechanic. His wife, Marlene, stayed home with their children, 12-year-old Caleb and 8-year-old Sophie. To those who knew them, they seemed like a quiet family, close-knit, without enemies or drama. As neighbors began hammering boards over their windows and stacking sandbags, the Duvalls did the same. Some assumed they'd evacuate like everyone else, but when the evacuation order was upgraded to mandatory and cars streamed out of the neighborhood, the Duvall vehicles never moved from the driveway. The decision to stay puzzled some of the locals. A neighbor recalled David on the porch, smoking a cigarette as he tightened plywood across the front windows. When asked if they were leaving, he reportedly said they had enough supplies that they'd be fine. Some took it as pride, others as recklessness, but in storm country, such choices were not unheard of. People weighed their risks differently. Some had nowhere to go, or no money for a hotel, or believed their homes were fortresses that had stood for generations. The last confirmed sighting of the family came just before the storm reached its peak. Around dusk, one neighbor claimed to see candlelight flickering through the boarded windows. Another recalled hearing faint laughter, the sound of children's voices drifting out before the wind swallowed everything. In the middle of chaos, it seemed almost ordinary, a family having dinner, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy as the world outside grew darker and louder. That night, Hurricane Maria made landfall. Winds lashed at 120 miles per hour. Power lines snapped, plunging entire counties into blackness. Water surged into low-lying neighborhoods, pulling docks, fences, and entire sections of road into the sea. For hours, the storm hammered the coast, destroying some homes, sparing others, and leaving behind a landscape that looked torn and rearranged by unseen hands. When morning came, survivors crept out of their shelters to face what remained. Trees were snapped in half, boats tossed into yards, shingles and glass scattered everywhere. First responders moved quickly, checking houses for those who had stayed behind. And when they reached the Duvall home, they found something unsettling. The house itself still stood. Though battered, the structure remained intact, the plywood clinging stubbornly to the windows. Inside, the air was heavy with the damp smell of storm-soaked wood, but nothing seemed out of place. Food sat on the counter, half prepared. A candle had burned down nearly to the wick in the center of the dining table. A school backpack rested on the couch, its contents untouched. Upstairs, the children's beds looked recently made, pillows neatly stacked. What was missing, however, was the family themselves. No muddy footprints led out of the house, no wet clothing hung to dry. Both family cars were still parked in the driveway, covered in a thin film of salt spray, but otherwise unharmed. It was as though, in the middle of the storm, the Duvalls had simply disappeared. At first, emergency crews assumed they had slipped out during the night, maybe to seek higher ground at the last moment. But as hours turned into days, shelters reported no sign of them. None of the evacuation centers spanning 3 counties had their names on record. Their relatives, who lived in a nearby inland town, hadn't heard from them either. Phone lines were down, but when communications were restored, there were still no calls, no texts, no messages. For neighbors, the realization hit slowly, like the receding tide revealing something deeply wrong. In a disaster where chaos was expected, there should have been wreckage or remains, something to point to their fate. Instead, there was only absence. And absence in its silence felt more terrifying than destruction. Rumors began almost immediately. Some whispered they'd been swept into the floodwaters and carried out to sea. Others said looters might have taken advantage of the storm's cover, breaking in and abducting them. But those explanations faltered when faced with the eerie details: the untouched food, the still burning candle, the cars that never moved. In the official report, the Duval family was listed as missing in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. But for those who had seen the light flickering in the boarded house, who had heard the sound of children's voices as the storm raged outside, the truth was harder to accept. Something happened in that home during the hurricane, something no one could see through the sheets of rain. And when the skies cleared and the winds calmed, the Duvals were simply gone. What no one knew then was that this absence would stretch on for years, and that the storm's silence was only the beginning of a mystery that would haunt the coast for the next 15 years. When first responders pushed through the battered neighborhoods after Hurricane Maria passed, the Duval house stood out, not because it was destroyed, but because it remained. Amid roofs caved in, trees toppled across driveways, and entire blocks reduced to heaps of splintered lumber, the Duval home looked almost untouched, as if the storm had passed it by with deliberate restraint. The plywood still covered the windows. The siding, though streaked with salt and rain, held firm. To the relief of the neighbors who returned from evacuation shelters, the house was still there, standing in defiance of a storm that had swallowed so much. But when the front door was forced open, what waited inside unsettled even the most hardened rescue crews. The living room smelled faintly of wax, the remnants of burned candles. A half-empty glass of water sat on the end table, beads of condensation dried into faint rings. The children's school bags, one pink with frayed straps and the other navy blue marked with patches, sat neatly against the couch, filled with notebooks and folders. It looked like any other school week had been interrupted, not a home bracing for disaster. In the kitchen, food had been left half-prepared. Vegetables still sat in a bowl, washed but never cut. A pan on the stove contained the beginnings of a meal, untouched and cold. Plates had been set at the table, as though the family had been moments away from sitting down together. Upstairs, clothing lay across the bed as if someone had been deciding what to wear. Everything suggested presence, yet the silence told another story. The most disturbing detail was what wasn't there. There were no muddy boot prints on the floor, no shattered glass, no signs of anyone forcing their way in. The front and back doors were both locked from the inside. Windows were sealed tightly behind the plywood. The house hadn't flooded, and the roof hadn't been torn off. Every sign of chaos and destruction that defined the storm outside had spared the inside completely. And yet, the family of 4 who lived there had vanished. Initially, investigators assumed the Duvals had left in the night, making a last-minute decision to evacuate. It was the simplest explanation, and in the chaos of disaster recovery, the simplest explanations often stuck. Officers noted in their first report that the family was likely displaced and would eventually show up at a shelter or with relatives. The problem with that theory appeared in the driveway. Both family vehicles remained parked, coated in a thin film of salt and dirt but otherwise untouched. Keys hung on hooks inside by the door. Shoes sat lined up on the welcome mat. If they had left, they hadn't taken the means to travel with them. As days passed, the assumptions began to unravel. When communication lines reopened and shelters compiled their rosters, the Duvals' names were nowhere to be found. Not in the county shelters, not in neighboring states, not even among the unclaimed survivors who filtered into Red Cross centers without IDs. Relatives inland reported no word, no phone calls, no sudden appearances at their doors. It was as if the family had simply skipped the act of surviving. For the community, unease began to spread. The hurricane had already left scars, but this disappearance unsettled in a different way. People could understand destruction. They could understand loss when it was visible. A roof torn away, a body pulled from floodwaters. What they couldn't understand was absence without explanation. Some neighbors admitted they had seen candlelight through the Duval windows the night before landfall. Some swore they'd heard children's laughter in the storm's pauses. These fragments of memory only deepened the strangeness. If the family had been alive and well hours before the storm hit, why did the house look like they had evaporated mid-step? The sheriff's office sent deputies back into the home, this time with more scrutiny. They photographed everything: the school bags, the half-prepared meal, the unmade beds. Nothing indicated violence, nothing suggested panic. The refrigerator still hummed softly, though its shelves were bare from pre-storm preparations. Drawers contained folded clothes, toiletries lined the bathroom counter, but no wallets, no cell phones, no signs of any deliberate packing. Within a week, the missing persons report was formalized. The sheriff stood before reporters, his words clipped but careful. The Duvalls had not been located, he confirmed. Their whereabouts were unknown. Search efforts would continue. But even he seemed unconvinced that the usual explanations would apply. When volunteers began canvassing, going door to door through damaged neighborhoods, the contrast was chilling. Every other family had either evacuated or was accounted for. Survivors recounted harrowing nights huddled in shelters or clinging to rooftops. Some had injuries, some had stories of narrow escape. But in every case, there was a record, until the Duvalls. They were the only family simply missing, their home untouched, yet their presence erased. Whispers began to circulate. The kind of rumors born when facts run dry. Some spoke of looters, though nothing had been stolen. Others speculated the father may have grown desperate or unhinged under the stress, leading his family into the storm. But these were theories without evidence, crafted in the vacuum left by silence. By the 10th day, reality settled heavily. The Duvalls had not turned up anywhere. They were not in shelters, not with relatives, not among the injured or the dead. Their home stood as a monument to their absence, a house that had withstood the storm but could not explain what happened inside it. And so, the official search began. Helicopters were dispatched to scan the coastline. Boats patrolled the inlets. Volunteers combed through marshes and drainage canals. Every ditch, every piece of debris was checked. Because if the storm had spared the house but taken the family, then somewhere nearby, the sea or the land still held its answer. The trouble was, nothing ever surfaced. In the days following the storm, the search for the Duvall family grew from a neighborhood effort into a coordinated mission. The Coast Guard deployed helicopters that skimmed low over the marshlands, their spotlights sweeping across waterlogged fields and broken tree lines. From above, the ground looked scarred, a patchwork of mud and wreckage. Every dark shape had to be investigated, every tangle of debris checked for what might be hidden underneath. Search crews dropped markers into the water, sending boats to follow up. Time was critical. If the family had been caught in the floodwaters, their chances of being found alive slipped further away with each passing hour. Volunteers dragged the canals with grappling hooks, pulling up twisted fences, tree branches, and even overturned sheds, but no sign of the Duvalls. Divers combed deeper channels, braving the black water filled with silt and broken glass. More than once, searchers thought they had something, a bundle of fabric snagged on a log, a pale shape beneath the surface, but each time it dissolved into debris. The storm had scattered everything, and in its aftermath, every clue looked like a ghost of something that wasn't there. Cadaver dogs were brought in, trained to detect the faintest traces of human scent. Handlers walked them along the shoreline and through marsh grass heavy with standing water. At one point, a dog stiffened and pulled toward a bend in the shoreline where floodwaters had receded. Searchers marked the spot, digging through the muck and brambles, but there was nothing. Just waterlogged earth and the faint impression of where the dog had caught something fleeting. A second dog confirmed the same area, circling restlessly, noses pressed to the ground. Then, just as suddenly, the trail vanished. It was as if the scent had ended at the edge of the tide, carried out and erased. That single moment sparked two theories that would divide locals for years. The first was simple, tragic, and believable. The Duvalls had been swept into the rising water. The family could have tried to flee on foot during the peak of the storm, disoriented in the dark, overtaken by the surge. The sea had claimed countless lives before, and in a hurricane, the ocean was an unforgiving thief. If that was the case, then their bodies could have been carried miles offshore, lost forever. But others found the absence harder to explain. If the storm had taken them, why wasn't there debris? Why weren't there clothes, shoes, or even small belongings washing back in, the way so many other fragments of ruined lives had? And why had the dogs detected something so close to the shoreline, only for it to stop abruptly? Some whispered that the family had been taken during the storm, not by water, but by people. The chaos of disaster created opportunity. Roads were empty, communications down, entire neighborhoods left without power or patrols. If someone wanted to make a family disappear, what better cover than a hurricane? The sheriff's office pressed for more answers, but each avenue collapsed under the weight of nothingness. The helicopters reported only wreckage. The divers found no bodies. The volunteers returned empty-handed after days of slogging through mud and wreckage. The search began to feel like chasing shadows, each lead dissolving the moment it was touched. At community meetings, the atmosphere grew tense. Residents asked hard questions. Why was there no trace? Why had their house survived untouched while they had not? Could looters or drifters have come in under cover of the storm? The officials repeated the same measured words. The search was ongoing, no evidence of foul play, all possibilities being considered. But the silence beneath those statements was louder than the storm had been. As the days stretched into weeks, the official presence began to scale back. The Coast Guard shifted resources to other emergencies. Volunteers returned to repairing their own homes, their energy drained. What remained was the empty shoreline where the dogs had stopped and refused to go further. The image lingered with many, an invisible line where something had ended, where something had begun. The mystery deepened, not because evidence was uncovered, but because no evidence existed at all. No footprints, no clothing, no personal belongings drifting in with the tide. The Duvall's absence was more complete than any disaster could explain. It was this void that began to eat at the town, that made people question not just where the family had gone, but how such a disappearance was even possible in plain view of their own neighbors. By the end of the third week, the official search reports listed the case as unresolved, but among the locals, whispers grew darker. Some believed the sea had claimed the family, others swore something human had. In either case, the Duvall home still stood, silent and waiting, as if daring anyone to step inside and understand what had happened there. And in that silence, the absence grew heavier, becoming something more than tragedy. It became a mystery that no one could put to rest. Weeks passed, and with them, the physical scars of Hurricane Maria slowly began to heal. Streets were cleared of debris, power was restored to most neighborhoods, and the community tried to stitch together a sense of normalcy. But while homes could be repaired and roads rebuilt, the absence of the Duvall family remained like a wound that refused to close. In a storm where destruction had been widespread, their survival should have been a relief. Instead, their intact home became the epicenter of unease. People passed it with lowered voices, glancing toward its shuttered windows as though the walls themselves held an unspoken truth. Rumors began to swirl in the void left by unanswered questions. Some said looters had come in the night. In the chaos of a hurricane, with law enforcement stretched thin, it wasn't unthinkable that desperate men could have targeted the home. But nothing was stolen. The food was still on the counter, the cars were still in the driveway, the jewelry and valuables untouched. Others whispered a darker theory, that David, the father, had snapped under the crushing stress of the storm. Perhaps he had done something unthinkable to his wife and children, hiding them in a way the hurricane concealed. It was an idea that horrified people, yet they repeated it anyway, because horror was easier to grasp than nothing at all. The family's relatives spoke out against such rumors, describing David as a quiet, steady man who loved his children and would never harm them. Friends echoed that sentiment, insisting the family had been close and content. But in the absence of evidence, suspicion became its own kind of evidence. Every memory was reinterpreted, every conversation scrutinized for hidden meaning. Someone recalled an argument overheard weeks before the storm. Someone else mentioned Marlene once confiding that she felt isolated. Each fragment, real or imagined, was picked apart, reshaped into a possible explanation. The truth was that no one knew anything, and so everyone filled the silence with what they feared most. Candlelight vigils were organized in the town square. At the first, a few dozen people gathered, holding photographs of the family. Children from Caleb and Sophie's school made posters, their crayon letters spelling out pleas for answers. As weeks turned into a month, the gatherings grew. Hundreds of residents came, their faces drawn by exhaustion and grief. Prayers were spoken, hymns sung, but beneath the solemnity lay a shared unease. This was not just grief for a family presumed dead. It was fear, fear of not knowing how or why they had vanished, fear that if such a thing could happen to the Duvalls, it could happen to anyone. Investigators, pressed by reporters and the community alike, had little to offer. Privately, some admitted what they would not say on record. They had nothing. No footprints leaving the property, no signs of violence, no bodies, no ransom note. The sheriff confided to one volunteer that he had never seen a case with so little to hold on to. Storm deaths left traces, abductions left trails. This case left nothing. It was as though the family had dissolved into the storm itself, leaving behind only the shell of their lives. In the absence of facts, theories spread like wildfire. Some believed they had staged their disappearance, fleeing under cover of the storm to escape debts or secrets. Yet their bank accounts remained untouched, their belongings left behind, and no sightings emerged despite the wide reach of the investigation. Others leaned toward supernatural explanations, whispered only when they thought no one official was listening. They spoke of the storm taking them in a way no one could understand, as though Moriah itself had claimed them. These whispers were dismissed publicly, but privately they reflected the depth of confusion, people grasping for explanations in a situation that offered none. Meanwhile, the Duval home began to change in the eyes of the community. What had once been a neighbor's house became something else, a place people avoided walking past at night. Children dared each other to touch the porch. Adults muttered about strange feelings when they passed. The silence of the home, its frozen state of half-prepared meals and abandoned belongings, was a constant reminder of what was missing. It stood as if waiting for the family to walk back in. But each passing day made that hope harder to hold. Local news stations ran features on the case, interviews with tearful relatives, timelines of the family's last known hours. But media attention brought no answers. For all the speculation, for all the man-hours poured into searching, there was no resolution. The story became less about the storm itself and more about the enduring mystery it left behind. By the second month, the official tone shifted. The sheriff's office described the investigation as active but limited, words that sounded like retreat to those who wanted answers. For the town, the silence of the authorities spoke volumes. Behind closed doors, investigators had run out of leads. They could not prove abduction, could not prove accident, could not prove foul play. All they could admit, though rarely in public, was that the Duvalls were gone, and they had no idea how. And so, the case settled into a strange limbo, not closed but not progressing, leaving the community trapped in unease. At vigils, people still prayed, still lit candles, but beneath the flickering light was resignation. Hope was thinning, fear was thickening. And with each passing week, the story of the Duvalls shifted from tragedy to legend, a mystery that clung to the town like a shadow. But while the community struggled with rumors and unanswered questions, the official search was about to stall. What lay ahead were dead ends, false leads, and the gradual fading of urgency. Yet the silence around the family would only grow heavier, turning absence into obsession. In the months that followed, investigators pursued every thread, no matter how fragile. Each lead felt like it might finally break the silence, only to collapse under scrutiny. Early in October, a woman in Louisiana swore she had seen a family resembling the Duvalls at a rest stop off the interstate. She described a man, a woman, and 2 children, disheveled but alive, piling into a beat-up van with no plates. Detectives rushed to check security footage, but the images were too grainy, the family unidentifiable, the van untraceable. Within days, the tip unraveled into nothing. A week later, beach patrols stumbled across an abandoned fishing boat washed ashore 30 miles east. Its engine was flooded, its deck scattered with debris. For a moment, hope flared. Maybe the family had used it to escape the storm. Forensics teams combed the vessel, scraping for DNA, checking registration numbers. Nothing tied it to the Duvalls. The boat had been registered to a man who had reported it stolen months before the hurricane. That, too, dissolved into dead air. Neighbors came forward with memories that blurred under time and fear. One insisted they had seen strange lights outside the Duval home the night of the storm, flickers beyond the candlelight, almost like car headlights pulling up to the driveway. Investigators logged it, but no tire tracks had ever been found. No witnesses corroborated the claim. Another neighbor recalled hearing what might have been shouting carried through the wind, but even she admitted the storm could twist sounds into illusions. These accounts fueled whispers of abduction, of intruders taking advantage of the chaos, but without physical evidence they remained just that, whispers. Psychologists consulted on the case floated a more clinical theory. In high-stress disasters, families sometimes panic, making fatal choices in the dark. Perhaps the Duvals attempted to flee on foot at the height of the storm, disoriented and exhausted, only to be overtaken by water. Mass drowning was their explanation, not foul play, not mystery, just tragedy magnified by circumstance. But when pressed, even the psychologists admitted the lack of bodies was troubling. Hurricanes left behind the dead. They did not make entire families vanish without trace. Detectives expanded their net to surrounding states, checking hospitals, shelters, even schools for children registered under new names. They investigated reports of squatters in abandoned buildings, drifters camping along the interstate. Each possibility ended the same way: not the Duvals. By November, weeks of exhaustive work had produced no single piece of physical evidence beyond what was already known. No footprints, no clothing, no wallets, no cell phones. Even the family's digital presence was silent, bank accounts untouched, phones dead, emails unopened. The weight of futility began to crush morale inside the sheriff's department. One deputy privately confessed that every day they hoped for a body to surface, just so they could have something solid to hold on to. Instead, they were left chasing shadows. Tips phoned in by psychics, rumors spreading across online forums, people claiming to have overheard confessions in bars. Each had to be checked, each ended in disappointment. Meanwhile, the community's theories multiplied. Some became elaborate, almost conspiratorial. People claimed the family had staged their disappearance to start fresh under new identities. Others insisted the storm had hidden a crime, that David had killed his family and vanished. A few leaned toward the supernatural, saying the hurricane had swallowed them whole, taken them somewhere no one could follow. The sheriff's office tried to push back, urging patience, but without answers, their words rang hollow. By December, funding for the official search was under review. The county had poured resources into helicopters, boats, forensics, and manpower for nearly 3 months with nothing to show. Disaster relief efforts demanded attention elsewhere. Quietly, the state signaled that unless new evidence emerged, the case would no longer receive active funding. The sheriff fought the decision, arguing that the disappearance of 4 people could not be treated as a dead end, but the decision came anyway. The search was scaled back, the case shifting from active pursuit to background monitoring. For the Duval relatives, the news was devastating. Marlene's sister spoke tearfully to local reporters, accusing officials of giving up. She said her family deserved answers, that someone had to know something. But sympathy couldn't stretch resources. The truth was that without leads, without bodies, there was nowhere left to look. The case file grew thick with false starts and abandoned notes. Unverified sighting. No connection. Negative DNA. Each page was a reminder not of progress but of absence. Detectives began to rotate off, their attention pulled to fresher cases where evidence still existed. The Duval file slid toward the shelf, its mystery preserved in silence. By early spring, the disappearance had become less of a police investigation and more of a ghost story told in the community. Theories circulated in diners and church basements, but each conversation ended the same way. No one really knew. The only certainty was that a family had gone missing in the middle of a storm, and after months of searching, no one could explain how. The official word was blunt. Without evidence, there was nothing more to do. The funding was gone, the manpower withdrawn, the case left to linger in the background. To the people who had prayed at vigils, who had walked the marshes with dogs and dragged the canals with hooks, it felt like abandonment. To the investigators who had spent sleepless nights chasing tips that always collapsed, it felt like defeat. And so, the Duval disappearance entered its first true silence. The storm had passed, the community had begun to heal, but the absence remained, lodged deep in the town's memory. For now, the case was still open, but in reality it had slipped into the shadows, waiting for years to pass before anyone would dare disturb it again. As the seasons turned and the years slipped by, the Duval disappearance sank deeper into the fabric of the town, becoming less an open case and more a ghost that hovered at the edges of memory. At first, people still drove past the house to glance at it, expecting perhaps some sign, some change, some answer hidden in its silence. But as time moved on, fewer eyes turned toward it. The plywood warped and cracked, windows shattered in storms that followed, and the porch surrendered to creeping vines. What had once been a home now looked abandoned, a husk that mirrored the absence inside. Children dared each other to step onto the porch, but adults crossed the street rather than walk too close. It became a landmark of unease, a place that reminded people of something unresolved, something they didn't want to admit could happen again. The case file itself collected dust in the sheriff's office. Every year or two, a new deputy would flip through it, scanning the faded reports, but nothing new emerged. Detectives retired, volunteers grew older, and the urgency that had once propelled the search faded into resignation. No bodies surfaced, no belongings washed ashore. The hurricane had left behind wreckage everywhere else, but where the Duvals were concerned, it left only silence. Yet that silence never erased the whispers. Each hurricane season brought them back, like the return of something unfinished. When winds howled and streets emptied under evacuation orders, people remembered the family who had stayed, who had laughed by candlelight, and who had then been swallowed whole. Some said their mistake was not leaving, that their fate was a warning about pride. Others insisted darker forces had been at work, that the storm had been a cover for something human. Whichever version people repeated, the story always ended the same. No one knew what had really happened, and no one could explain why. The Duvals' relatives lived with the weight in a way no one else could. Marlene's sister came back to the shoreline every year on the anniversary, placing flowers in the sand where the water met the land. For the first few years, others joined her, neighbors, classmates of Caleb and Sophie, even strangers drawn by the mystery. But as the years went on, fewer showed. Life moved on for most people. The vigils stopped, the crowds thinned. The flowers, however, remained. Every year without fail, someone knelt at the shoreline, marking time with the ache of not knowing. David's parents passed away still asking questions. Marlene's sister never stopped writing letters to newspapers and state officials, begging for the case to be reopened, for divers to drag the waters again. She kept photographs of the children on her mantle, their faces frozen at 8 and 12, never aging as the world around them did. With each year that passed, hope thinned into something quieter. Something less about finding them alive and more about finding anything at all. Closure, even in grief, would have been better than endless absence. The town, in its own way, absorbed the loss. New families moved in, children grew up without memory of the storm, and the Duval story shifted into folklore. It was told in fragments as if details were too heavy to carry intact. Teenagers whispered about lights in the Duval house at night. Fishermen muttered about ghosts seen on the water's edge during hurricanes. None of it was provable, but all of it fed the lingering unease that the family had not simply been erased, but taken. 15 years passed. The house, finally condemned, sagged under its own decay. Its porch collapsed, vines choked its siding, and storms tore at what remained of the roof. The town had largely looked away. But beneath the surface, the unease never left. To this day, many who had lived through the hurricane said they could still remember the feeling of the days after, how everything was wreckage and ruin, except for that one house where the storm had spared the walls but stolen what was inside. And then, in the fall of 2023, something surfaced. A fisherman working the waters off the coast trawled his nets as he had countless times before. He expected nothing more than shrimp, tangled seaweed, and the usual debris dredged up from the bottom. But when he hauled the nets aboard, among the usual catch was something sealed, heavy and unnatural, a cooler, coated in mud and barnacles, its lid still strapped down tight. At first, he thought nothing of it. People lost all kinds of things in storms, coolers, crates, barrels. But when he tried to open it, the weight inside was wrong. The silence inside was wrong. He reported it as protocol demanded. When authorities pried it open, what they found inside was small, fragile, and devastating. Bones. Tiny bones wrapped in fabric that had once been a blanket. It was no longer a rumor, no longer a ghost story. For 15 years, people had whispered about the Duvals, had wondered if they were alive or dead. In that single moment, the silence broke, and the sea returned something it had hidden. What had been a haunting absence now became a case reopened. In late September of 2023, the Gulf was calm. The water that had once been the stage for Hurricane Maria now lay quiet under a pale sky, broken only by the hum of trawlers cutting across its surface. For local fishermen, it was another morning of work. Nets cast wide, hauls pulled in heavy with shrimp, crabs, and the occasional scrap of storm debris stirred from the seabed. Among them was Thomas Ray, a man who had worked these waters for 3 decades. He knew the ocean's habits, knew the weight of a net before he even saw its catch. That morning, when he hauled up his nets, the weight was different. Tangled within the ropes and silt was a rectangular object coated in mud and barnacles. At first glance, it looked like trash, a discarded cooler that had spent years drifting at the mercy of tides. Thomas pulled it aboard, shaking his head. He had found all manner of refuse in these waters before, but this cooler was sealed shut, straps still clinging to its lid despite years beneath the sea. He tried to pry it open, expecting rotten fish or ruined supplies. What struck him was the heaviness, a dense, unnatural weight inside that shifted not like food or gear, but like something else entirely. By instinct and law, fishermen who find unusual containers at sea are required to notify authorities. Drugs, weapons, even bodies had been discovered before, hidden in the anonymity of open water. Thomas loaded the cooler onto his deck and called it in. When deputies arrived at the dock hours later, they examined the corroded lid, noting the way barnacles had fused along its edges. Opening it required tools. A crowbar was wedged under the seal. When the lid finally gave way, the smell that drifted out was faint but unmistakable, the stale, sour odor of something long decayed. Inside was a small bundle, wrapped in fabric that had once been a blanket, though years in seawater had faded it to a dull, grayish hue. Within that bundle lay bones, fragile, small, unmistakably human. The sight froze everyone on the dock. Deputies exchanged grim looks while Thomas stood pale, realizing that what he had pulled from the sea was not trash, but the answer to a question that had haunted the coast for 15 years. The cooler was sealed again, taped, and transported under guard to the state forensic lab. Word spread faster than officials could contain it. By the time investigators confirmed what they suspected, the entire town knew. The remains might belong to one of the missing Duval children. Forensic anthropologists worked carefully, documenting every fragment of bone, every thread of fabric. DNA was extracted from the remains and compared against samples still on file from the early days of the case. Within weeks, the results returned. It was Sophie, the youngest of the Duval children. The confirmation sent shockwaves through the community. For 15 years, her face had been frozen in time, an 8-year-old girl smiling from missing posters and news reports. Now, her existence was no longer a mystery. She had not fled with her family, had not vanished into some unknown place. Her remains had been sealed inside a cooler and left to the sea. The implications of that were chilling. For investigators, the discovery reopened wounds and questions alike. How had Sophie's body ended up inside a cooler? Who had placed her there? Was it an attempt to conceal her death during the chaos of the storm? Or had something more deliberate, more sinister occurred that night? Forensics noted that the bones showed no obvious signs of trauma, but the state of decay after so many years made certainty impossible. The only definitive fact was that she had not drowned in open water, not been swept away by the tide. Someone had wrapped her in a blanket, sealed her inside, and left her to be swallowed by the Gulf. Relatives of the Duval family were devastated. For them, hope had always flickered, that the family had survived under new identities, that maybe one day they would surface alive. Sophie's discovery crushed that hope and replaced it with dread. If the youngest child had been found this way, what had become of the others? Where were David, Marlene, and Caleb? And what horrors had played out behind the walls of their boarded home as the hurricane raged outside? The town, once dulled by time into silence, erupted again with speculation. Some clung to the storm theory, saying perhaps the cooler had been a desperate attempt at preservation, a parent trying to keep their child's body safe when the flood took her. Others believed the discovery proved foul play, that someone had used the hurricane as cover to kill and conceal. Neither explanation brought comfort. Both only deepened the sense of dread that had never truly left. For detectives, the case file that had gathered dust for over a decade was pulled back into the light. Boxes of reports, photographs, and recordings were reopened, each detail now examined with fresh urgency. Sophie's bones were not just remains, they were evidence. And evidence meant the case was no longer a legend, but a crime scene that stretched across 15 years. On the shoreline where her aunt still laid flowers each year, new bouquets appeared overnight, left by strangers who had never even known the family. The silence of 15 years had been broken, and though it brought no peace, it brought something else, the certainty that the story of the Duvals was not over. The Gulf had returned Sophie, and somewhere out there, it still held the rest of the truth. When the DNA confirmation came back, the case of the missing Duval family transformed overnight from a haunting legend to an active investigation. Files that had sat untouched for more than a decade were pulled from storage, boxes stacked high in the sheriff's office conference room. Detectives, some of them too young to even remember the initial search, now found themselves poring over faded reports, grainy photographs, and transcripts of interviews taken 15 years earlier. The discovery of Sophie's remains had not solved the case. It had reignited it. Forensics began with the bones themselves. Anthropologists worked carefully, reassembling what remained of the child's skeleton. The conclusion was sobering. The bones bore no obvious trauma. There were no fractures, no knife marks, no bullet holes. But the state of decomposition made certainty elusive. After years submerged in salt water, the body carried only fragments of its story. What stood out was not what was on the bones, but what surrounded them. The blanket, though faded and degraded, had been carefully wrapped. Fibers clung in a deliberate pattern, as if she had been bound or swaddled before being sealed in the cooler. The cooler itself offered another layer of questions. Marine experts examined the corrosion and buildup along its surface, estimating that it had been submerged since the night of the hurricane. They explained that the Gulf's currents could easily drag such an object into a marsh, bury it under silt, and keep it hidden for years until storms or shifting tides freed it. To them, the timing made sense. The cooler had likely been lodged in mud for over a decade before breaking loose and drifting into the path of the fisherman's net. But this explanation only covered how it resurfaced, not how it had come to be there in the first place. Investigators circled back to the most unsettling fact. Someone had placed Sophie inside, wrapped in a blanket, and sealed the lid. This was not the work of a hurricane. A storm could destroy, scatter, and drown, but it could not swaddle a child, tie down straps, and close a cooler with deliberate force. That act had been human. Detectives revisited interviews from 2008. They reread the statements of neighbors who reported candlelight through the boarded windows, laughter before the winds reached their peak, and the silence that followed. They traced every rumor of arguments, every whispered suspicion that David or Marlene had been struggling. Nothing conclusive had emerged then, and nothing conclusive emerged now. But the discovery of Sophie's body changed the weight of those testimonies. Words once dismissed as gossip now seemed worth re-examining. The Sheriff's Department requested assistance from the State Bureau, bringing in specialists trained in long, cold cases. Together, they began constructing a timeline. If Sophie had died the night of the hurricane, then the most likely location of her death was the Duval home. If she had been sealed in the cooler that night, then someone had carried it out into the storm, past the locked doors, and into the chaos of flood and wind. That someone had to be either family, neighbor, or stranger who managed to enter unseen. Each possibility was disturbing in its own way. Relatives were re-interviewed. Marlene's sister broke down when told of the discovery, asking again and again why Sophie had been treated that way. David's relatives remained defensive, insisting he could never harm his children. Detectives pressed them, searching for cracks, but grief and loyalty blurred the truth. No one admitted to suspicion. No one confessed to knowledge. The community responded with shock, but also with a grim sense of inevitability. For years, people had argued over whether the family had drowned or been taken. Sophie's discovery tilted the balance toward the darker theories. The fact that her body had been concealed suggested intent, and intent suggested crime. No longer could the case be explained away as a natural tragedy. It was now officially treated as a homicide investigation. Forensics teams scoured the old Duval property again, though it had long since rotted into ruin. The house, condemned years earlier, offered little. Still, ground-penetrating radar was used in the yard, cadaver dogs brought in once more. Nothing surfaced. The silence of the home remained intact, refusing to give up its secrets. Marine units expanded their searches offshore, trawling near where the cooler had been recovered. Divers worked channels and marshes, probing for anything buried in silt. At times they pulled up scraps of fabric, fragments of metal, even bones from animals mistaken for human. But the sea yielded no further answers. Sophie was alone. Detectives wrestled with the implications. If Sophie's remains had been deliberately concealed, then what of Caleb, David, and Marlene? Had they too been hidden, their bodies waiting somewhere in the Gulf or buried inland? Or had Sophie's death been an isolated act within a larger, still missing story? Each theory was charted, each lead examined, but the evidence was too thin to draw lines with certainty. The discovery, for all it revealed, left investigators with more questions than answers. It confirmed Sophie's fate, but it did not explain it. It proved human involvement, but it did not say whose. And it reopened a case that had haunted the town for 15 years, ensuring it would haunt for years more. In the sheriff's office, the thick case file was placed once again at the top of the stack, marked with a new label: Active Homicide. For the first time in over a decade, there was momentum. And yet, momentum without clarity is its own kind of torment, because the only certainty investigators had gained was that Sophie had not vanished into the storm. Someone had taken steps to hide her. And that single truth suggested the rest of the family's disappearance was far darker than anyone wanted to imagine. As detectives pressed deeper into the reopened case, the narrative of a family swept away by a storm began to unravel. The discovery of Sophie's remains had changed the investigation from natural tragedy to something human. And once that shift occurred, every old testimony, every overlooked detail, took on new weight. Neighbors who had once spoken only in whispers were re-interviewed. Some admitted things they had held back 15 years earlier, not wanting to cast suspicion during a time of grief. One recalled hearing muffled shouting through the boarded windows the night before Mariah made landfall, not the normal tension of storm preparations, but something sharper, angrier. Another said she had seen Marlene outside, days before the hurricane, pacing the yard on the phone, her face tight with frustration. At the time, people dismissed it as nerves. Now, it sounded like something more. The family's relatives, too, began to provide fragments that had once seemed insignificant. A cousin stepped forward, saying that in the summer of 2008, Marlene had confided she was thinking about leaving David. She hadn't said much, only that she felt worn down, that she sometimes wondered if the marriage could last. There had been no talk of violence, no threats, but in the context of a vanished family and a child found concealed in a cooler, those words carried a new and chilling gravity. Investigators took these accounts back to the forensics lab, hoping for something more concrete. That was when specialists revealed a detail that froze the room. Trace toxicology tests on Sophie's remains, limited though they were after years in seawater, showed faint evidence of sedatives. The levels were low, degraded, and impossible to measure with precision. But their presence could not be dismissed. Someone had likely given the child medication before death. Whether it was intended to calm her during the storm, to ease fear, or to silence her for darker reasons, no one could say. But combined with the fact she had been wrapped and hidden, The implication was devastating. The theory began to shift. What if the Duvals had not simply vanished into the storm? What if the storm had been the cover? In the chaos of evacuation, in the silence of power outages, it was possible for terrible things to happen unnoticed. If there had been conflict in the marriage, if Marlene had been planning to leave, perhaps tensions had reached a breaking point that night. Some investigators theorized that David, facing the loss of his family, had acted out of desperation or rage. Others considered whether Marlene, overwhelmed, might have done the unthinkable. Still others wondered if someone outside the family had taken advantage of their turmoil and of the hurricane itself. The problem was that none of these theories could yet be proven. The bones offered only fragments of truth. The testimonies were blurred by time. What remained undeniable, however, was the shift in focus. This was no longer the story of a family swallowed by nature. It was the story of a family undone by something far darker, something rooted in human decisions, human actions, human secrecy. The town, once again stirred by headlines, braced itself for what this new phase of the case might reveal. For years they had lived with the mystery. Now they had to confront the possibility that the truth was not a storm's cruelty, but something closer to home. And as investigators pushed forward, sifting through rumors, retesting evidence, and re-examining every piece of the Duval history, they prepared for the final question no one wanted to ask aloud. If Sophie had been hidden, what had happened to the rest of the family? And where were they now? The discovery of Sophie's remains had reignited a storm of its own, one made of questions and speculation, of headlines and whispers that rippled through the community. Detectives pressed forward with renewed urgency, combing through the same waters where the fisherman's net had pulled up the cooler. Marine units ran sonar across the seabed, divers sank into the murky depths, and trawlers dragged the channels again and again. If Sophie had been hidden there, perhaps the others would be too. For weeks, the search yielded only fragments of the Gulf itself, twisted metal, sunken logs, remnants of boats lost to hurricanes past. But then, near the same stretch of water, dredging crews pulled up something that made investigators fall silent. Tangled in mud and kelp were pieces of bone, brittle and pale, too broken and eroded to be whole. At first, no one could say if they belonged to a human at all. The fragments were rushed to the forensic lab, where under careful analysis, the verdict came back. They were human, and they were female. DNA testing took longer, but when the results returned, the truth was clear. The fragments matched Marlene Duval. After 15 years, the storm had given up another of its secrets. The announcement struck the community with the same force as the first discovery. Vigils returned to the shoreline, flowers once again laid in the sand. For Marlene's relatives, it was both relief and agony. The confirmation gave them something solid, a final answer to where she had ended up. But it also deepened the questions of how she had gotten there. Unlike Sophie, there was no cooler, no wrapping, no sign of deliberate concealment, just fragments carried and broken by the sea. The father and son remained missing. David and Caleb had left no trace, no bones, no belongings. For investigators, this split the case into even sharper mystery. Had the family been victims together, swept into the chaos of the storm with only Sophie deliberately hidden? Or had the concealment of the child pointed to a more sinister explanation, something done by human hands while nature masked the act? Theories multiplied once again. Some investigators leaned toward a murder-suicide scenario, suggesting David had acted in desperation as Marlene planned to leave him, then taken his own life with Caleb, lost alongside him. Others argued for abduction, that someone outside the family had entered during the storm, taking advantage of the cover to commit a crime and dispose of the bodies. Still others whispered of a calculated cover-up, that the placement of Sophie in the cooler was too deliberate, too careful to be anything but planned. What made the case all the more haunting was that none of these theories could be proven. The fragments of Marlene's body revealed no clear trauma. The cooler gave no fingerprints after so many years in the water. Every piece of physical evidence was partial, degraded, resistant to answers. The truth seemed always just out of reach, dissolved by time and tide. The case was declared partially solved. Authorities announced that the remains of Sophie and Marlene had been positively identified, their deaths confirmed. But the fate of David and Caleb remained unknown. Official reports acknowledged the uncertainty. Murder-suicide, abduction, accident all remained possible. Without further evidence, the story could go no further. For the community, closure was impossible. The discoveries had given them pieces of the puzzle, but pieces were not enough. The house where the family had last been seen still stood in ruin, rotting into the ground, a monument to what had vanished inside. Every hurricane season, people remembered. Some left flowers. Others told the story to newcomers, their voices hushed, their eyes scanning the shoreline as though expecting the sea to give up one more secret. 15 years after the storm, the Gulf had returned fragments, but not the whole truth. It had given them a child, a mother, and silence where the others should have been. What happened that night, whether born of rage, despair, or the hand of a stranger, remained unspoken, locked away by the same waters that had hidden them for so long. And so, the case lingered in half-light, suspended between tragedy and mystery. The sea had given back just enough to remind everyone what was lost, but not enough to explain why. What remains unspoken still haunts the town, a story without an ending, carried on every wind that rises when the Gulf begins to stir.